watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and welcome to my Spider-Man movie retrospective review series. And today, we're starting out with the first big-budget, wide-release Spider-Man film, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Now, this is a movie that I absolutely adored as a kid. I remember seeing this at least 4 times in the theater when it came out, and even when the other 3 films were released and the trilogy was over, I still found myself loving this the most out of the 3. But then the news broke about the franchise rebooting, and that split the Spider-Man fanbase in 2. Half were against it rebooting, and the other half was perfectly fine with a reboot. And honestly, I didn't care either way, but for the hell of it, I decided to take a look back at the Sam Raimi trilogy, of course starting with the first Raimi film, just to see how those films held up, and if a reboot was really necessary. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, then you know exactly which side I picked. Okay, so before I go any further, yes, I understand that this film is a modern classic that gave birth to the golden age of superhero films. However, just because something is a classic, don't mean it's good. So, starting off with the cast and characters, first we have Tobey Maguire in the lead role as Peter Parker Spider-Man, and he's not great. Now, that's not to say that I don't like Tobey Maguire as an actor. In the only other films that I've seen him in, which are Seabiscuit and Brothers, I actually think that he's really good. But he's not Peter Parker. Peter Parker, while yes, is a nerd, is also a naturally charismatic guy. That's why when he's Spider-Man, he's this goofy, over-the-top cartoon character, because deep down, Peter has a certain flair. Okay, not that kind of flair, but close enough. However, the only reason he never showed this side of himself to people in high school was because he was also very reserved and antisocial. And the reason he was antisocial and isolated himself from everyone around him was because he didn't hold to the same interest as the other kids at Midtown High. Therefore, he sectioned himself away from them and focused more on his schoolwork instead. And this gave kids like Flash Thompson and Liz Allen and Sally Averill the wrong impression of Peter, and it gave them this misconception that he thought that he was superior to them in some sense, because he was a teacher's pet and he didn't want to hang out with them, which is why they bullied him in the first place. But once Peter got to college and started loosening up a bit, everyone started to see Peter for the fun-loving guy that he actually was, and none of that is really in Raimi's depiction of Peter Parker or Maguire's performance. And that's not to say that if it's not like the comics, then it's not good at all. There are tons of movies that deviate from source material that I prefer, honestly, to the source material. So that's not the issue. The issue is that Peter Parker in this film is an incredibly watered down substitute in relation to his comic book counterpart. He's bullied because he's weird. And he's weird because he's just weird. There's no exploration or explanation for why he is the way he is, or why he's so out of touch with reality. He just is. And that's the major mistake that this film makes, because the thing about the relationship between Peter Parker and Spider-Man is that they both influence each other. Spider-Man is Peter's release, oh god, that sounds so awful, because he has total anonymity, which means he's free to be himself. But then we have Tobey's Peter Parker, who is kind of a dork with no real other standout qualities to himself, which means that on the rare occasion that you do see Spider-Man joking around and throwing out quips, it feels stiff and obligatory. Like, it doesn't feel natural for that character to do. And at the end of the day, he's just not Spider-Man at all. And that's of no fault to Tobey Maguire. I just don't think that he was properly cast in this role. If anything, I think it should have went to Topher Grace or James Franco, who both of which I think auditioned for this role in the first place. Then we have Mary Jane Watson, who's played by Kirsten Dunst, and I don't hate her in this movie. That comes later. Now, I actually like Kirsten Dunst in this film. I think she does a good job of playing the role that she's given, except the only problem is that the role she's given isn't Mary Jane Watson. Like, at all. And as I said on the channel plenty of times before, I love MJ, she's one of my favorite comic book characters of all time, and Kirsten Dunst, just like her co-star Tobey Maguire, was not written or directed to be anything like MJ in the comics. And once again, I'm not saying that changing characters from their comic book counterparts in an adaptation is a bad thing, because there are a lot of cases where it works out just fine. But when you change a character and make them significantly less interesting than their source material counterpart, yeah, that's where you start to run into some issues. Mary Jane Watson in the films is a very self-absorbed, unlikable human being. I mean, she's nowhere near as bad as she'll be in the subsequent films, but again, that comes later. Plus, she has a weird thing in this movie where she's constantly trading up. Like, she goes from dating the high school jock to dating the rich kid to chasing after the superhero, and it just makes her come off like a shallow whore. And trust me, I'm not using those words lightly. And that's just not MJ at all. And moving right along, we have Harry Osborn, and James Franco is, well, he's not quite the James Franco that we all know and love just yet.
We are same, but different.
But he's not bad. In fact, I'd argue that he's one of the most relatable, nuanced human characters in this entire film. If anything, I feel the most sorry for him, because he's constantly being toyed with by everyone in the film just to fulfill their own personal desires. Although, once we get to the final act, he makes a weird heel turn on Peter and MJ where he starts to hate them because he caught them holding hands. And yeah, hand-holding can be viewed as somewhat inappropriate in some relationships, but if my best friend's aunt was just attacked by a psychopath dressed up like a Power Rangers villain, and my girlfriend was holding his hand in the hospital room where his aunt is fighting for her life, my first thought wouldn't be, oh, the bitch is cheating. Perhaps she's just being a decent human being for once and showing that she has the ability to care for someone other than herself? Maybe? No? Okay. Anyways, moving on, we have Norman Osborn, who is masterfully played by Willem Dafoe, and honestly, this character is the best part of the film. The man is a cartoon character. Even before he gets the Goblin Serum, Willem Dafoe just knows exactly what kind of movie he's in. He knows the film is a live-action cartoon, but, like, not in a good way, and he's just having fun. Although, if I'm gonna be that nerd right now, as much as I love the performance, this guy isn't really the Green Goblin. And by that, I mean, he kind of is. I know they're adapting the version of the 90s animated series because that version of the Green Goblin was more of a split personality, but pretty much everywhere else, Norman became the Green Goblin so that he could become a crime lord. And in order to prove how tough he was, he chooses to go after Spider-Man, who was the next big thing. But after he keeps getting his plans thwarted, he develops a creepy obsession with Spider-Man that then leads into a creepy obsession with Peter Parker. But in the movie, Norman's motivation is constantly changing until it starts to become unclear what his motivation actually is. At first, he becomes the Green Goblin after his experiment goes wrong and he kills the military general who wouldn't take his product. Then his motivation is to kill the board of directors after they sell Oscorp behind his back. Then his motivation is genocide. With the help of Spider-Man? It just makes no sense, and it's really stupid. But it's almost forgiven because of Dafoe's really standout performance. But with that in mind, I will say that one actor who rivals Dafoe in this movie is none other than J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. Honestly, I don't know what I can say here. His performance is masterful. He's the best actor to portray the character in live action, and his performance will never be topped. The man is off the page J. Jonah Jameson. He's insane. And again, much like Dafoe, Simmons knows exactly what kind of movie he's in, and he chews the scenery like bubblegum. But what I find genius about his performance is that Simmons never goes too far in the realm of cartooniness, because there were scenes where he's playing the role straight, and in those little scenes, he comes off as a fully realized character. Specifically the scene where the Green Goblin attacks the Beagle, and Jameson, who was being a total douche to Peter just a couple moments prior, puts his life on the line to protect Peter and ensure his safety. And this is a performance that only gets better as Simmons continues to play the character in subsequent films. And finally, we have Rosemary Harris and the late Cliff Robertson as Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and there's not really a lot to say on these two, seeing as how Rosemary Harris's Aunt May doesn't really get a lot to do until the second film, and Uncle Ben kind of feels like he's just there to die in order to get the ball rolling for Peter to become Spider-Man. That said, once again, their characters are right off the page, just like J. Jonah Jameson, and they're really endearing to watch. As far as the plot goes, the movie kind of doesn't have one. You can basically sum up the entire film by saying Peter gets spider powers, Norman gets schizophrenic Captain America powers, they fight 3 times, and the movie ends with Norman dying. Also, MJ's a thought, but nowhere near as bad as she'll be in Spider-Man 2. Oh, and Harry Osborn is the most sympathetic character in the movie. Seriously, that's it. And as a bare bones plot, that's fine, but none of the connective tissue is strong enough to hold the piece together. And the 2 major problems this movie faces are that the Green Goblin doesn't have a set motivation, and the hero of the story is far too reactionary. The cool thing about Norman Osborn in the comics is that he's a schemer and an industrial saboteur using the Green Goblin to do his dirty work. And the cool thing about Peter Parker is that he's a proactive protagonist, and none of that is put to the forefront. And look, I get it, this is an adaptation, therefore certain changes have to be made in order to translate the material to screen. But that excuse doesn't work when the changes made make the material significantly less interesting as a whole. See, what would have made the movie more interesting, in my opinion, is if after the board of directors sells Oscorp behind Norman's back, the Goblin starts killing off members of the board, and Peter notices a pattern in the Goblin's murders, and he does what he can to protect the surviving members of the board, only to find out that the murderer is his surrogate father figure. And then to add an extra layer of complexity, have Norman address the hypocrisy of Peter while he's trying to stop Norman from trying to hurt the people who took everything from him, while Peter let the man who killed his Uncle Ben die when he clearly could have saved him. And that's not me rewriting the script. I'm just playing up what's already there. Honestly, this movie feels like the first draft of a Spider-Man film as opposed to a film that was in development for 10 plus years. I will say though, for all the film's narrative flaws and miscastings, I do think the action sequences are really well handled. And even though a lot of the visual effects are pretty dated, I do love when the film goes for more practical effects. Plus, the swinging is breathtaking in this movie, even when it is for the wrong reasons, but that's a rarity. And I haven't gotten to the cinematography, but Don Burgess does the Lord's work in this movie. This film is photographed beautifully. As far as the score by Danny Elfman goes, I love it, but only within the context of this movie. But that's more because of the tone and style that was established by Sam Raimi, because as much as I love the score as a piece, it does feel a bit too grand scale and epic in nature for a character like Spider-Man. And the last thing that I wanted to mention was the costuming. Now personally, I don't mind the Green Power Rangers Goblin costume, although I do think that within this heightened cartoony universe that Sam Raimi established with the first film, the comic book costume would have worked perfectly, and there's actual behind the scenes footage of an animatronic Green Goblin mask that was molded after Willem Dafoe, but apparently it was too uncomfortable for him to wear. As for the Spider-Man costume, I'm not a fan. Now look, I get it, this costume is iconic because it's the first big budget live action motion picture Spider-Man costume, but it's too big budget Hollywood for Spider-Man, especially when the narrative establishes that Peter can barely afford a car. Plus, I'm just not a fan of the aesthetic choice of the silver raced webbing or the angled eyes. The costume overall is not my bag. And I'm trying my hardest not to bring up the James Cameron scriptment that this movie is pulling heavily from, because A, that's merely a script, whatever the hell that is, and not a full-blown film, but just on a narrative level, that scriptment makes more sense than the final product that we got. I mean, the relationship stuff between Peter and MJ is more or less the same, and there is a weird obligatory James Cameron sex scene between the two, but at least MJ is written as a more likable character, and Peter is more of a nuanced individual. Plus, there's an actual narrative reason for Peter to have organic webbing, and it doesn't just feel like a random change for the sake of making a random change. And even little simple stuff like the costume and where it comes from is explained in simple ways that really make me scratch my head as to how we go from that rough outline to getting what we got in 2002. Anyways guys, those are just my thoughts regarding the 2002 Spider-Man movie, and I know this is gonna sound ultra petty, but after 6 or 7 years of being told, you're wrong, the Sam Raimi movies are masterpieces, and since you don't like them, you're not a true Spider-Man fan, it does feel somewhat pleasing to know that more and more people are coming around on the idea that these films aren't the cinematic masterpieces that they were originally helmed as. But what about you? What are your thoughts on the film? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Does it hold up? Because it sure as hell doesn't for me. But let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie, thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.